What actually happened on Easter Sunday? Christians love to tout the resurrection of Jesus as the only possible explanation, while doubters, skeptics, and atheists oftentimes will push back with other explanations as to what could have happened. So today I thought it would be fun to take a bunch of different explanations that are given for the resurrection of Jesus, and I'm going to create a tier list out of it, because why not? First up, you have the twin theory. Now, the idea that Jesus had a twin is nothing new. This dates all the way back to the Gospel of Thomas, I believe in the 2nd century CE, shortly after Jesus' death, close to the time that the other Gospels were written, and the Acts of Thomas, the Apostle Thomas, who was with Jesus. And it positions the disciple Thomas as a twin of Jesus. Thomas Didymus. Didymus actually meant twin. Now, here's where it gets interesting. What if, instead of Jesus dying and resurrecting, one of the twins died, and then the second twin showed up afterwards? Because we already have other gospels that acknowledge that Jesus not only had a brother, but did in fact have a twin, it's not unreasonable at all to assume that he did actually die and that his twin was mistaken for him afterwards. I'm gonna put this one in A tier, starting off strong. Next up, we have grief hallucinations. It's the idea that Jesus did actually die, and then that people did actually see him afterwards, but that they were hallucinating. I don't particularly find this one all that compelling, because while there are instances, like the case with Our Lady of Fatima, where people would have group hallucinations and that they would see something like a light in the sky and they would all have this mass hysteria, freak out, thinking that they were witnessing a saint. It is possible for stuff like this to happen, and it is actually common for people who are going through loss and bereavement to experience grief and to think that they have heard the voice of a loved one who has passed, or that they have seen someone who passed away. But the idea that the entire religion purely sprung up out of a grief hallucination, it is possible, but I don't think it's the most compelling of all of them. I'm gonna put it in C tier. And then there's the idea that Jesus was pure myth, that he never existed, there never was a guy named Jesus, that he was invented out of whole cloth, and that there never was a guy at all. There's a couple of different ways that mythicism is proposed, that it's put forward. I particularly don't find any of them all that convincing, and I just find it an unnecessary hypothesis, because you have plenty of figures like this at the time of Jesus who were springing up, who were claiming to be a Messiah. A Messiah literally just meant a king. It meant anointed one, and the king was anointed with oil. So it was people who wanted a following, they wanted power, they wanted to potentially raise up an army or overthrow the Romans, or just have some sense of, I am a leader and I have meaning and my purpose is to rule over all these people. You have this happening all over the place. People were forming revolts and rebellions against the Romans. People were performing miracles. People were gathering followings. In fact, there wasn't just one Jesus. If you read the works of like Josephus, there are multiple people at this time who he refers to as Jesus who were actually these prophet-like figures. There is literally a dude who prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple for years, despite being interrogated by the Roman governor and flogged by the Jewish authorities. During the Roman siege of Jerusalem, he was wandering around on the walls preaching like a nut when he got converted into a pancake by a Roman catapult stone. He never wound up becoming the Jesus that billions of people follow today. But the idea that Jesus was just completely invented out of whole cloth, I find that unbelievable, usually for stories like this to form, and especially with so many like multiple attestations. Yes, they were later. Yes, they were written down after the fact. Yes, they probably changed as word of mouth was causing these stories to go through kind of a telephone-like phase. There was no internet. There was no telegraph. There weren't newspapers, but there was writing. It did get written down eventually, and there were a lot of different perspectives on him. I think he probably was a dude, because having a dude exist is a very low bar. Billions of dudes have existed in history. So I'm going to put pure myth down in D tier. But I do think that there is merit to the idea that a lot of the stories, especially all of the miracles, but a lot of the stories about Jesus, whether or not he went down to Egypt, whether or not he was born in Bethlehem, I think a lot of these were written into the story, that there probably was a guy named Jesus from Nazareth who got a following and convinced some of them he had miraculous powers, but a lot of the stories that then ballooned out of proportion were almost definitely pulled out of whole cloth, and, they're big fish stories. Maybe he, touched someone and they said that their pain went away, and they're like, oh, this person, they haven't been able to see in 50 years or since birth or whatever, and now they have 20/20 vision. I'm like, yeah, that's absolutely blown out of proportion, but it probably was like the faith healers today where, he touches them, lays hands on them, and they think that it's better. They think that there's some marginal improvement in something, and it's just placebo or other natural effects. You have people with cancer who certain cancers have spontaneous rates of remission, and yet they'll attribute it to the divine. So I think that there probably was a dude named Jesus, but a lot of the stories is people after the fact going, well, the Messiah wasn't supposed to come from Nazareth. He was supposed to come from Bethlehem. So somehow we've got to get him from Nazareth down to Bethlehem, and we've got to fulfill this prophecy and that prophecy. So they're writing all of these things into the text. And especially you look at like the Gospel of Matthew, he'll change things. He'll copy verbatim from the Gospel of Mark, which was written earlier. And then he'll add little things in, and he'll add these notes that say, in order that the prophecy might be fulfilled. It's like, yeah, right, buddy. Okay. But that's how legends work. So I'm going to put legend, I think it's most likely to put it in A tier, but it's I don't know, it's not particularly interesting. I'm going to pop it in B tier because B tier is looking awfully lonely. And then there's swoon theory, which posits the idea that Jesus was crucified, but he didn't actually die. He maybe came within an inch of his life, and when he was taken off the cross, he was tossed in a ditch or buried or something, and yet he recovered. He came back to life, and he either crawled out of the ditch or crawled out of the grave, or someone saved him and rescued him, nursed him back to health, and then he presented himself as resurrected. This one I don't find all that compelling because the Romans were particularly good at executions, but there have been plenty of people in history who were buried, who were thought to be dead, who wound up still being alive. And it's why they would attach bells to graves in the Middle Ages sometimes, because there were cases where people would wake up in a coffin clawing in the inside, and sometimes they were even interred afterwards and they found scratch marks on the inside of a coffin, and the person basically came back not to life, but reanimated, and when they woke up, they found themselves buried alive and couldn't get out and suffocated to death. So this one's not impossible, but I'm probably going to put it at the bottom in D tier. And then we have impersonators. This one is not talked about nearly enough. I think it is one of the coolest explanations because it taps into a core aspect of human psychology and the way that we think and the way that we think we can't be fooled, but we fall for things all the time. And it's the idea that Jesus had impersonators. Just for a modern day parallel to this, I recently did a video on Francis Schlatter, who said that he was a second coming of Jesus. He was a modern day Messiah. He was a faith healer. He performed all these signs and wonders, and then he disappeared into the desert and died. We have his bronze rod that he would wave around to do his miracles. They found his horse and his saddle, his engraved Bible, and his skeleton. This dude was dead. And yet, afterwards, all of these imposters realized the opportunity here with a miracle man with thousands of followers, and they realized that there was an opportunity to lead a movement, to make money, to bilk the followers, to sell holy blessed handkerchiefs. And so all over the place in the late 1800s, early 1900s, people popped up claiming that they were Francis Schlatter, and some said that they were resurrected, some said that he didn't actually die, but that they were him. But they saw an opportunity to impersonate someone. Now you take that back 2,000 years, and here you have no newspapers, no photographs, no telegraph. There's no way of verifying it. Half of the people there never would have seen him or never would have seen him up close. And it would be very easy to fool quite a few people in this type of a situation. So the documentation from this time period, we have pretty much nothing within 100 years of Jesus' death. I find it quite plausible that when a messianic figure with a large following dies, that you would have people popping up afterwards saying, hey, I'm him resurrected. Even with Francis Schlatter, people who knew him, when they saw the imposters, there were people who knew Francis Schlatter personally who believed that the imposters were legitimate, that they were actually him, or that he had somehow changed slightly after he died, and that he had a different glow about him. So I don't find this one unbelievable at all. In fact, I think it's one of the coolest ones, possibly one of the most believable. I'm going to put it in S tier. And then there is the liar hypothesis. C.S. Lewis put forth this idea that Jesus could only be a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. And I think that that's incredibly limiting. I think that there's a million different hypotheses, but there is the possibility that none of this happened, that Jesus wasn't crucified, that he wasn't beaten, that all of these stories were literally pulled out of thin air. You have examples of this happening in modern day, where you will have these apostolic pastor, prophet, leader, teachers like Todd Bentley, who will come along and say that he's raised all of these people from the dead.
25 years of ministry in 73 countries, I've seen 37 people raised from the dead.
Or W.V. Grant that'll say that they've done all these miracles.
We've seen 6 people raised from the dead.
The dead man began to move.
We've seen midgets grow.
Some of them will even say that they themselves rose from the dead.
One time I was preaching in Africa and I died and had a heart attack and died. Came out of my body. I died. Died. And guess what? Got raised from the dead.
And people eat it up. They buy it cold turkey. So the idea that 2,000 years ago that people were somehow less gullible than they are today, I find highly unlikely, highly unbelievable. I could easily go back, assuming time machines existed, I could go back to the year 0 and bilk a bunch of people out of, well, they didn't have a lot of money back then, so I guess I'd be bilking them out of fish. But I could go back to this time period, say that I resurrected, and say that some wonderful, incredible things happened. And sure, there would be doubters and you'd have skeptics just like any time, but you would also have a lot of people that would be like, wow, that's amazing. God spoke to you. And if you add things like the power of suggestion, faith healing miracles, through the placebo effect and, the pain numbing effects of adrenaline and all this other stuff that I've touched on my faith healing series of how people fool people, then it's very easy to see how people who already believe in a lot of these religious ideas would fall prey to someone who is acting as a mouthpiece of God. So I'm gonna pop this one in A tier. And then there is the idea that Jesus was actually resurrected, that he physically rose from the dead. I have been around this planet, all over the planet. I've seen a lot of crazy things, but I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that people do not come back from the dead. I'm not talking about near-death experiences where they go into a coma-like state or their heart stops.
Well, it just so happens that your friend here is only mostly dead.
I'm talking brain dead, dead. You're out, you're gone, 3 days, completely dead, come back to life, doesn't happen. It violates all of the laws of physics. There is no precedent for this happening whatsoever. The idea that somehow it's more plausible because it happened way back when stuff wasn't well documented, when we didn't have doctors and lab tests and stuff. Like, if God wanted to come down and convince people of something that is of that level of monumental importance that people actually believe it because all of their eternal souls is on the line, to do it in this remote part of the world and not have a shred of evidence for it. Jesus didn't write anything firsthand. We have no piece of anything that he built himself. We don't even have secondhand accounts of things that people wrote about him. We have stuff, maybe 4th, 5th, 6th hand pseudepigraphal accounts written decades after the fact, and those don't survive. We don't have those. We don't even have anything for pretty much a century until after he died. And it's like, this is the milieu in which the most important story is supposed to be passed on. And this is the idea of an all-knowing, all-powerful deity that then miraculously raised the Son of God to life. Like, I don't waste my time. It's bullshit. I'm gonna pop this one. If there was an F tier, I'd put it way down in F tier because it's way less believable than D. In fact, I'm gonna pop Legend up to A. I'm gonna move this one up to B. I'll move these into C just so that Actually Resurrected gets its own little absolute BS all the way down at the bottom. Any one of these explanations I find infinitely more plausible than the fact that he is raised from the dead, because we're talking about impossibilities versus things that actually do happen all the time that we have precedent for, that we see happening all around us, that people fall for cults doing all kinds of stuff like this. One quick bonus one that I almost forgot about is propaganda, and it's the idea that the entire story of Jesus being this Messiah-like figure, his death, his resurrection, that all of it was a form of propaganda. You have two different trains of thought. One is that it's the Jewish propaganda and that they're trying to make sense of a world, especially after the fall of the temple, that they're putting forth this idea that maybe their Messiah was actually not this literal king with a physical kingdom of this world, but maybe that it was something spiritual, and it's a way of coping, like a coping mechanism. The other is that it's a form of Roman propaganda, and that the Romans were tired of continuously over and over and over fighting these messianic-like figures that would pop up by this oppressed people group, that they were tired of having to put down rebellions. And so they created this figure who is actually peaceful and religion is all about loving your enemies and turning the other cheek and forgiving everyone, including your enemy, and that Jesus's kingdom is not of this earth and that you should give to Caesar what is Caesar's and pay your taxes. A peaceful Messiah that is an alternative to these freedom fighters who were trying to overthrow the empire. I think that there are probably people on both sides who were kind of coping with the destruction of the temple, and that affected the stories surrounding Jesus, both by his followers, people who knew him, as well as, you know, people who maybe weren't Christian yet and they were looking for something to latch onto. I think it's not unlikely or unrealistic that the Roman Empire would try to influence these ideas as well. But I don't really find the idea that maybe Jesus never existed and he was purely propaganda. I don't find that all that believable. Maybe he was a legend and propaganda latched onto it. I'm going to put this one in B tier. And then finally, we have the last explanation for today, the combo. This is the idea that it's not just one of these, that it's a combination of different things all happening at once around one figure. So let's say that you had a figure like Jesus who actually existed, who was larger than life, who lied like a master manipulator, created all kinds of crazy stories about him that people believed, that he had a twin, and that after he died, that there were people who mistook his twin for him. At the same time, after he died, there were impersonators that saw an opportunity and latched onto it. I mean, you've got stories like the Road to Emmaus where there were people who didn't recognize him, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, that was Jesus, after he sat down and had dinner with them. That's the kind of thing that you would expect from an imposter. It's also quite possible that this story was warped and twisted as a form of propaganda, that there were people who had grief hallucinations and thought that they heard his voice or saw him in visions afterwards. I think absolutely a lot of these stories ballooned out of control with each retelling, and that there was a kernel of truth and an actual figure that then became a legend. There were people who said, oh, he totally appeared to this person or that person. But we have accounts from that time of legends and stories blowing out of proportion that we know were not true. The idea that the explanations for the resurrection stories and narratives around Jesus was just one of these, I find highly unlikely. So in this situation, you're not just looking at one explanation. You're not just looking at, well, is it more likely that Jesus had impersonators or that he rose from the dead? Well, I think it's more likely. Well, obviously, it's more likely that he had impersonators than that he rose from the dead, but it's way more likely that it was a series of all of these things, or a lot of these things playing in tandem in a very complicated situation after the death of this messianic figure. So I am going to pop combo all the way up here in S tier. It is creme de la creme, and whenever people from the apologists, Christian apologists, religious creationist side try to put forth these creationist stories as this is 100% literal truth, gospel truth history, and that based off of a minimal facts argument like Gary Habermas puts forth, that somehow the actually resurrected explanation is the best of the best. Don't waste my time with that. There are so many better explanations. There are so many different ways that these stories could have come together. What do you guys think? How would you rank it? Let me know in the comments below if you disagree with my ranking system, if you would do it differently. Also, were there any that I missed? Any particularly good explanations or particularly bad explanations? Let me know in the comments below as well, because I would love to see alternative explanations. Thank you guys so much for your ongoing support. If you appreciate videos like this and you want to support more of them, you can make either a per video pledge on patreon.com/holykoolaid or a one-time PayPal donation. Thank you guys so much, and as always, dare to be curious, but don't drink the Kool-Aid.